It wasn't a sudden burst of religious fervor. It wasn't a desperate bid for public approval. It wasn't even a tax strategy designed to preserve the family name. It was a terrifying realization of the mathematical end of an era. The year is 1901. Andrew Carnegie sits in a room with J.P. Morgan. A piece of paper slides across the desk. $480 million. In today's terms, as a percentage of the economy, it is a sum that defies comprehension. Roughly $300 billion. The culmination of the industrial age. The peak of American steel. But as Carnegie walked away, he didn't feel triumph. He felt a heavy, suffocating weight. A weight that would drive him to spend the rest of his life frantically giving it all away. He called it the disgrace of dying rich. But beneath the philanthropy lay a darker understanding. He had seen the machinery of capital reach its absolute zenith, and he knew what history demands when wealth concentrates to that degree. He knew the cycle was turning. A pattern is unmistakable. It is written in the ledgers of every fallen empire. It is etched into the debased coins of Rome. It is printed on the worthless paper of Weimar. The accumulation of staggering wealth is not the beginning of a golden age. It is often the final signal before the collapse. The arithmetic is merciless. When the capital stock concentrates in too few hands, the system inevitably seeks a release valve. That release valve is currency destruction. Carnegie got out at the top. He converted industrial dominance into gold bonds before the world tore itself apart in 1914. But for the rest of society, the pattern was just beginning its brutal descent. We are watching the same mechanism grind into gear today. The incentives are aligning perfectly. The constraints are tightening. To understand why a man would give away $300 billion out of fear and guilt, you have to understand the fire that consumes that wealth if it stays. This is not a story about charity. It is a story about the life cycle of empires. We will examine this through 3 specific historical case studies: the Roman Empire's 3rd century crisis, the Spanish Empire's price revolution, the Weimar Republic's hyperinflationary collapse. Just like the Gilded Age, each began with a period of unparalleled dominance. Just like today, each ended with a bewildered middle class holding assets that had turned to dust. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages, and current data suggest we are accelerating through the final phases right now. The only variable is timing and pain. To understand the magnitude of the guilt and the precision of the pattern, we must first look to the archetype of all imperial collapses. We must go back to a time when the entire known world was held together by a single currency and see how the decision to alter that currency by a fraction of a gram destroyed a civilization that had stood for 1,000 years. The Roman Empire did not fall in a day. It did not vanish because of a single barbarian invasion or a solitary plague. It rotted from the inside, driven by a monetary cancer that began with a decision that seemed at the time to be merely a practical adjustment. The year is 64 AD. The emperor is Nero. The city of Rome has just been ravaged by the Great Fire. The smoke has barely cleared from the Palatine Hill, and the cost of reconstruction is staggering. The treasury is strained. The legions on the frontier require payment. The grain dole for the citizens must be purchased. The arithmetic of the empire is underwater. Under these constraints, the rational move for a ruler concerned with short-term survival is not to cut spending. It is not to raise taxes on the powerful senators who could assassinate him. The incentive is to find a shortcut. Nero orders the mint to do something that had never been done in the history of the silver. Denarius. He reduces the purity of the coin. He drops the silver content from 100% to roughly 90%. Think about the immediate effect. To the average shopkeeper in the Subura, the coin looks the same. It weighs nearly the same. It bears the face of the emperor. It is legal tender. But the state has just created free money. They have expanded the money supply without expanding the supply of goods. It was a subtle theft, a shaving of value that transferred wealth from the saver to the state. It seemed like a genius solution to a fiscal crisis, but it broke the seal. Once the taboo against debasement was broken, the incentive structure for every subsequent emperor was permanently altered. Fast forward to the reign of Septimius Severus in the late 2nd century. The timeline here is critical because it mirrors the acceleration phase we see in modern monetary systems. Severus was a military man. He understood power in its rawest form. On his deathbed in York in 211 AD, he gave his sons Caracalla and Geta a piece of advice that would become the epitaph of the Roman economy: be harmonious. Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men. Enrich the soldiers, this was the imperative, the loyalty of the legions was the only thing standing between the emperor and a violent death. But the cost of that loyalty was rising faster than the productivity of the empire. To pay for the massive wage increases for the military wage, increases that were necessary to keep the regime in power. Severus and his successors ramped up the debasement. The silver content of the denarius began to freefall. It went from 90% to 70% to 50%. By the time we reached the crisis of the 3rd century, around 270 AD, the currency had collapsed completely. The silver content was down to less than 5%. The coins were essentially copper washed in a thin layer of silver that would rub off after a few exchanges. This was not an accident. They had stored their labor in the medium of exchange provided by the state, and the state had stolen it bit by bit. Then all at once, the reaction of the state to this chaos is the most chilling parallel to our present day. In 301 AD, the Emperor Diocletian attempted to fix the problem by decree. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices. This was a massive document that listed a price cap for every good and service in the empire, from a bushel of barley to the wages of a camel driver. Penalty for violating the edict was death. The preamble to the edict is fascinating. Diocletian blames the inflation not on the debasement of the currency, which he himself had continued, but on the avarice of merchants. He paints the government as the victim of greedy speculators. The society bifurcated into a tiny elite who owned the physical assets. The land, the gold, the slaves, and a massive underclass who owned nothing. The liquidity that had allowed for social mobility was gone. The ladder was pulled up. In 1545, a native Peruvian named Diego Gualpa discovered the largest silver deposit in history at a place called Potosi in modern-day Bolivia. It was a mountain of silver. The Spanish crown, led by the Habsburgs, began to extract this wealth on an industrial scale. Convoys of galleons, the famous treasure fleets, crossed the Atlantic year after year, their holds bursting with silver ingots. To the Spanish kings Charles V and Philip II, this looked like a miracle. They believed they had been handed an unlimited credit card by God. They used this silver to fund the most powerful military machine in Europe. They fought wars in the Netherlands, in Italy, in Germany, and against the Ottomans. They built massive cathedrals and palaces. They imported luxury goods from all over the world. Spanish. Wool and cloth became too expensive for anyone to buy. Foreign goods were cheap in comparison. The Spanish middle class was hollowed out. The landed aristocracy, who could raise rents, survived. The crown, which could tax the silver imports, survived for a time, though they defaulted on their sovereign debt repeatedly. Philip II, ruler of the richest empire on earth, declared state bankruptcy 4 times during his reign in 1557-1560, 1575, and 1596. Think about what that means. The entity with the monopoly on the world's money supply went broke 4 times. How is that possible? Because the more silver they imported, the less it purchased. They were running on a treadmill of diminishing returns. The incentive was to import more silver to pay the debts, which caused more inflation, which made the debts harder to pay in real terms, necessitating more silver. The human cost was visible in the streets of Castile. An observer in the late 16th century noted that Spain has become the Indies for the foreigner. The wealth flowed right through Spain. It landed in Seville, but it ended up in the pockets of Dutch bankers and Italian merchants who actually produced the goods the Spanish consumed. The Spanish people became merely the conduit for the silver, impoverished by the very wealth they ostensibly owned. The psychological toll was immense. Why work hard when the real money was in securing a government pension funded by silver or speculating on the arrival of the next fleet? The Hidalgo mentality took over the idea that manual labor was beneath a gentleman. This cultural shift, driven by the distortion of easy money, set Spain back for centuries. It still controlled vast territories on the map, but its economic heart had stopped beating. Just like the Spanish Empire, the Weimar Republic in Germany provides the most terrifying example of how quickly a modern, sophisticated, industrial society can descend into absolute monetary madness. This is not ancient history. It happened to a population that was highly educated, disciplined, and culturally advanced. The Weimar hyperinflation of 1923 is often misunderstood. It didn't start with the printing presses running hot in 1923. It started in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I. The German government, led by the Kaiser, made a fatal calculation. They decided not to fund the war through taxation. They believed the war would be short and that they would pay for it by imposing reparations on the defeated Allies. So they suspended the gold convertibility of the mark and funded the war entirely through borrowing and expanding the money supply. They lost the gamble and they lost the war. The new Weimar Republic was born with a massive debt overhang and a shattered economy. Government was weak. It did not have the political capital to raise taxes or cut spending. The austerity required to stabilize the currency would have led to immediate revolution. So the rational move under these constraints was to print. But the velocity of money began to pick up. As people realized the government had no plan to stop printing, they began to spend their marks faster. Then came the catalyst. The German government ordered a policy of passive resistance. They told the workers to go on strike. But to keep the workers from starving, the government had to pay their wages. Paying millions of workers to produce nothing they couldn't print the notes fast enough. 1,000 marks became 1 million. Workers were paid twice a day. They would hand over bundles of cash, and the wives would run to the nearest shop to buy anything, bread, coal, soap, before the prices went up again in the afternoon. The rentier class, the elderly, the widows, the pensioners who had saved all their lives in government bonds, were wiped out completely. But here's the key insight that links back to our theme of guilt and positioning. The inflation kings like Hugo Stinnes made fortunes. Stinnes was an industrialist who understood the arithmetic. He paid back the loans later with worthless paper money. He effectively bought the German economy for free. This transfer of wealth was violent and visible. The social fabric tore apart. The middle class learned a brutal lesson. Playing by the rules is a suicide pact when the money is broken. Those who held on to the old morality, saving, working, trusting the state, were punished. Those who speculated, borrowed, and manipulated were rewarded. It was a complete inversion of values. These three cases: Rome, Spain, Weimar, demonstrate that the mechanism of collapse is agnostic to technology or era, follows a specific biological rhythm. It is not random. It is a sequence of cause and effect that repeats because human nature and political incentives do not change. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money. The empire or nation starts with a currency backed by hard assets or strict fiscal discipline. Trust is high. The economy grows based on productivity and savings. This is the Victorian era gold standard. This is the early Roman Republic. Stage 2 is the layering of liabilities. The society becomes wealthy and ambitious. It takes on obligations that exceed its immediate income. Wars, social programs, imperial expansion.